Story 1. The Cobbler Who Moonlighted as a Lockpicker. In the dim light of his workshop, nestled along a narrow alley in Nottinghamshire, a cobbler named Edwin Blackshaw bent over a worn leather boot. His hands were steady, his touch precise, and the neighborhood trusted him. By day, he was a craftsman of modest reputation, mending soles, repairing worn laces, and occasionally fashioning a new pair of work shoes for miners who labored in the nearby pits. But the town whispered of something else, something they could not quite prove. Edwin had a knack for locks. You wouldn't have thought much of it at first. A cobbler often kept small tools, needles, awls, and blades that could pry or pick. But Edwin's tools were not limited to leather. Beneath the floorboards of his shop, police would later discover an array of slender wires, tension tools, and skeleton keys. And though his business ledger looked ordinary enough, marked with the names of coal workers and farmers, he seemed always to live slightly better than his earnings could explain. Edwin's life on the surface was marked by quiet labor, yet Nottinghamshire police records of the late 1890s began to show a peculiar rise in break-ins, most of them committed without force. No shattered glass, no broken hinges, no crowbars left behind. The victims described the same unsettling detail. Their doors had been locked when they went to bed, yet valuables vanished as though the night itself had grown invisible fingers. Life in a coal town alley. Nottinghamshire was not a place of glamour. Soot blackened the windows and the air was thick with coal dust. Workers trudged to the pits before dawn and returned after dark, boots heavy, shoulders bent. The cobbler's trade was essential. Boots wore down quickly on coal dust and cobblestones. Edwin occupied an unremarkable place in this economy. Not wealthy, not destitute, just another tradesman whose lamp glowed late into the night. But observant neighbors noted his unusual hours. Sometimes his shop light flickered past midnight, long after the miners' lamps had gone dark. He explained it as late work, extra orders. Few questioned him until the burglaries began. The first known break-in. The case of Mrs. Carter, a widow who ran a boarding house for miners, became the first that police connected to Edwin. She woke one morning to find her lock intact but her strongbox empty. The strongbox itself was still locked when she showed it to the constables. No marks, no scratches, no sign of tampering. Yet the 30 pounds she had been saving for winter coal had vanished. When investigators pressed her, she recalled hearing footsteps in the hall at night, soft, deliberate, not the heavy stagger of a drunk miner. But when she lit her lamp, the hall was empty. It was the absence of evidence that troubled the police. And it was that very absence, the silent entry, the untouched locks that began to resemble the hand of one man. Edwin's secret hobby. As later records and testimonies revealed, Edwin had taken an interest in locks as a boy. Apprenticed to an older cobbler, he discovered how easily metal bent to patient fingers. What started as idle curiosity, opening padlocks left lying around, turned into fascination. He purchased manuals on locksmithing, some legitimate, others written for less noble purposes. He practiced endlessly, learning to feel the pins of a lock as if they were musical notes, each one waiting to be lifted in harmony. By his 20s, Edwin could open most common locks in under a minute. He kept this skill quiet, using it occasionally to help a neighbor locked out of a pantry or cellar. They thought of it as kindness. He thought of it as practice. Police suspicion. The police, of course, had little forensic science at their disposal in the 1890s. There were no fingerprints on file, no modern surveillance, but they did have instinct. Superintendent James Whitmore began to suspect that the burglar was someone trusted in the community, someone whose face would not raise alarm. When 2 break-ins occurred within a few streets of Edwin's shop, Whitmore decided to watch. Officers noted Edwin's late-night walks, his habit of slipping out of the alley after the lamps were dimmed, but they could never catch him in the act. A telling detail. One of Edwin's mistakes, however, would haunt him. In January 1898, during a burglary at the home of a merchant, a scrap of leather was found near the parlor window. It seemed inconsequential until an officer noticed the stitching, cross-hatched in a distinctive pattern used by only one cobbler in town, Edwin Blackshaw. When questioned, Edwin claimed he had been working late in his shop and could not explain how the leather came to be there. It was not enough for an arrest, but it planted a seed of certainty in Whitmore's mind. Growing tension in the town. For the townspeople, unease grew. Doors were bolted tighter, valuables hidden in strange places, chimneys, flour sacks, even beneath floorboards. Yet the burglaries continued, as if the thief anticipated every precaution. The community began to whisper that perhaps the culprit was not a man at all but something spectral. How else could a lock remain untouched while goods vanished? But Superintendent Whitmore was not inclined toward superstition. He doubled his patrols and kept Edwin under discreet observation. Unanswered questions. Was Edwin acting alone? Or was there a network of thieves who relied on his unusual skill? Why, if he had such talent, did he remain in a shabby cobbler's shop instead of moving to bigger prizes in the city? These questions lingered in the minds of police and townsfolk alike. What they didn't yet know was that Edwin's compulsion to pick locks had grown into more than theft. It had become an obsession, a need to prove mastery over mechanisms designed to resist him. And that obsession was about to lead him into a mistake too great to conceal. The winter of 1898 brought a bitter chill to Nottinghamshire. The coal fires burned late, and the streets crackled with frost. But inside Edwin Blackshaw's dim shop, warmed by the amber glow of oil lamps, the cobbler's hands worked with even more fervor. Not just on soles and laces, his late-night projects now included perfecting a set of lockpicking tools inspired by those he'd seen in an obscure German locksmithing book, smuggled to him years prior by a traveling tinker. It wasn't greed that drove Edwin. Not really. It was the thrill. A locked door was no different to him than a riddle, and the idea that someone believed a keyhole could keep him out. That was a challenge he couldn't ignore. And so, when the merchant's home had yielded to his tools in under 90 seconds, he didn't just take the silver coins inside the writing desk. He sat there in the dark for nearly an hour, simply admiring the lock he had conquered. He wasn't stealing, he was performing, at least that's how he saw it. A pattern emerges. Superintendent Whitmore was no fool. He knew that the burglar's style was distinctive. Clean, quiet, no broken windows, no force, no mess. But there was something even more telling. The burglar always took just enough. Never everything, never ransacked drawers or destroyed interiors. It's like he's leaving a signature, Whitmore told his junior inspector, Harold Symes, over tea. He wants us to know it was him, but not who he is. In one case, the burglar had left behind a half-finished meat pie on the kitchen counter untouched, cold but not stolen. In another, the man took 15 pounds from a strongbox but left 2 rings and a brooch behind. It was taunting, deliberate. Symes believed it was a gang, perhaps a syndicate from Derby, testing rural targets before hitting a bank. Whitmore disagreed. "One man," he said, "and I think he lives on these streets." A hidden room. In February 1898, Edwin made what might have been his most daring move. A magistrate's home, Sir Douglas Hamley, was found robbed. Though no jewelry or coin had been taken, his private documents had been rifled through. A single sealed envelope containing the deed to land in Durham was gone. Hamley's house was reinforced with heavy locks Chubb make, uncommon and difficult to pick without damage. But they bore no signs of forced entry. Whitmore was furious. This is no longer just a theft. Someone is targeting status, security, power. Unbeknownst to the police, Edwin had begun creating a secret annex in the back of his shop. A false wall, just wide enough to conceal a workbench and several shelves. There, he cataloged every lock he'd picked, diagrammed its inner mechanics, and wrote obsessively about improvements in his tools. It wasn't evidence, it was obsession. One shelf, lined with velvet, displayed locks from each of his conquests. Many were ordinary simple cabinet locks or wardrobe pieces, but others had names scrawled in pencil beneath them: Hamley, Carter, Wexley Hall. This room would be his undoing, but not yet. A failed attempt. Every great criminal makes a mistake. For Edwin, it came in the form of a badly timed return. He had entered the home of Mr. Reginald Cleaver, a retired banker with a notorious habit of keeping his savings hidden in plain sight. Edwin had learned, through small talk and shoe fittings, that Cleaver kept coin beneath the loose floorboard of his reading room. It was a simple lock. Edwin was in within 2 minutes. But what he hadn't anticipated was Cleaver's newly adopted stray dog, a mutt that slept under the desk. The dog lunged, growling, catching Edwin by the wrist before he fled through the kitchen. Though Edwin escaped, Cleaver reported the incident, offering a vague description. Short, wiry, wore a black cap and smelled of polish like leather, maybe. It was enough to concern Whitmore. A week later, Whitmore requested a visit to every cobbler within a 10-mile radius. Only one fit the profile and had a known fascination with mechanisms: Edwin Blackshaw. The first search. Police arrived on a gray March morning. Edwin welcomed them with a curious smile, wiping his hands on a rag. "Tools of the trade, gentlemen," he said, gesturing to the awls and tiny knives lined neatly on his work table. "You're welcome to look around." Whitmore noticed the cleanliness of the shop: no clutter, nothing hidden in plain sight. A back room revealed a cot, a kettle, and a few books. The only irregularity was a stack of journals on a shelf. When Whitmore flipped one open, he found detailed sketches of padlocks. "Just a hobby," Edwin shrugged. "I've always liked puzzles." No false walls were discovered, no stolen goods, no velvet-lined trophies. Whitmore left unsatisfied, but he ordered a tail on Edwin that very night. The tailing. Constable Lane, a quiet man with sharp eyes, was chosen to follow Edwin. He dressed in coal miner's garb and loitered outside the shop for several evenings, pretending to drink from a flask. What Lane discovered was subtle. Edwin left most nights around 1:00 a.m., carrying a small satchel. He returned no more than an hour later. Always alone, always quiet, never using the main road. One night, Lane followed him as far as the edge of Wexley Street, where Edwin paused, then seemed to vanish between two homes. But by the time Lane rounded the corner, Edwin was gone. He reported this to Whitmore, who made a chilling realization. He's not just good, he's rehearsed. He knows the alleys better than we do. A turning point. What Whitmore needed now was a warrant, but without hard evidence, he couldn't get one. So he waited. 2 weeks later, a break-in occurred at the vicarage. But this time, something had gone wrong. A heavy storm had rolled in, and lightning struck a nearby tree, sending part of it crashing onto the vicar's front porch. The sound startled Edwin mid-burglary. As the vicar ran downstairs, he caught a glimpse of the figure escaping through the back, his boot catching on a planter, causing him to stumble. The vicar swore he saw the glint of a metal tool fall from the man's pocket. The next morning, police found it, a handcrafted tension wrench, fine as a surgical instrument. No blacksmith had made it. This was the work of someone with a leatherworker's dexterity. The second search. This time, Whitmore got his warrant. The search was meticulous, and after 3 hours of combing through floorboards and walls, they found it: the hidden annex behind a false panel in the rear wall of Edwin's shop. Inside, over 50 locks, some labeled with names. A bound notebook detailing entry times, strategies, and a crude map of the vicarage. Diagrams of lock-picking tools, some hand-forged, others modified from awls. A list of targets with a strange notation system. Locked, locked, crossmark too risky, white heavy checkmark completed. It was not just evidence, it was a manifesto. Edwin's arrest. When they returned to arrest him, Edwin was at his workbench polishing a boot. He looked up, eyes calm. "I suppose it's over," he said softly, "but I never took more than I needed." Whitmore stared at him. "You took people's peace." Edwin shrugged. "It was never about the money." He went quietly, no resistance, no confession, just that same curious smile. But one puzzle remains. As police cataloged Edwin's trophies, they noticed something odd. Several locks were labeled with names of people who never reported being robbed. Yet inside each lock was a tiny strip of paper, slipped between the mechanism, each with a date and time, often several months earlier. These were homes Edwin had entered and left without taking a thing. Why? Was it practice, a calling card, or something deeper, an unspoken belief that simply opening the lock was the prize? The courts would focus on the thefts, but Whitmore remained haunted by the untouched homes. What message had Edwin left behind? And if those homes were never robbed, how many others did he slip into unseen, unnoticed, undisturbed? It was the trial that the people of Nottinghamshire never expected, and yet they turned out in quiet droves: miners, merchants, mothers with babes in arms. Edwin Blackshaw, the gentle cobbler of Pudding Lane, stood before the magistrate not as a humble tradesman, but as one of the most precise and persistent burglars in the region's recent history. He faced 17 counts of burglary, 12 of trespass, and 3 of possession of unlawful tools. Yet no witness could recall him ever being violent, and none of the victims had seen his face clearly. All the charges stemmed from evidence found in the hidden room behind his shop. And Edwin, he didn't deny a thing, but he didn't exactly confess either. "It wasn't the taking," he said during the first day of proceedings. "It was the entering. The lock was the challenge. Everything after that was secondary." The courtroom unfolds. The courtroom was a sparse, cold place. No gallery, no drama, just the solemn exchange between Crown prosecutors and Edwin's court-appointed solicitor, a nervous man named Gerard Price. Edwin never showed anger, fear, or remorse. If anything, he appeared almost relieved, as if the burden of secrecy had grown too heavy over the years. The prosecution presented diagrams from Edwin's notebooks, maps of homes, lock tool designs, and journal entries that matched the dates of reported burglaries. One by one, homeowners were brought in to testify. Most remembered nothing unusual, just a sense afterward that something had changed in the house. An open drawer, a light left on, a smell of polish in the air. The evidence was damning, yet oddly poetic. And when it came time for Edwin to speak for himself, he simply stood, adjusted his coat, and said, "Some people collect stamps. Some people climb mountains. I unlocked doors that were meant to stay shut, not because I wanted what was behind them, but because I could." The courtroom fell into silence. The journal pages. More troubling than the burglaries themselves were the dozens of entries in Edwin's journals referring to houses no one could trace, marked only by shorthand symbols, and what appeared to be longitude and latitude coordinates. Police would later determine that several referred to vacation cottages, unoccupied manors, and even the occasional hunting lodge in Derbyshire. In those entries, Edwin described not thefts but presents. He noted what books were on the shelf, what meals had been left unfinished, what brand of perfume lingered in the air. Some entries were uncomfortably intimate. Small girl's room, doll on shelf with missing eye, music box played, Greensleeves, no one heard me. Man in chair asleep, snores softly, I watched for 12 minutes, never stirred. Whitmore read them with a grimace. This wasn't burglary, he told the court. It was intrusion of the deepest sort, a dismantling of the boundary between public and private life. Sentence and silence. In the end, Edwin was sentenced to 10 years in HMP Dartmoor, one of England's most unforgiving prisons. It was both more and less than some had expected. No violence meant no harshest penalties, But the psychological weight of his crimes, this stealth, this subtle breaking of societal trust, left an impression that couldn't be shaken. He entered prison quietly in April of 1898. The people of Nottinghamshire returned to locking their doors more tightly at night, though none believed locks offered the same safety they once did. Whitmore, for his part, felt no satisfaction. "He took more than things," he said to Symes during a final walk past the now-abandoned shop. "He took space. The idea that your home is yours, that's harder to replace than silver." What happened to Edwin? Edwin's time in Dartmoor was unremarkable by official accounts. He worked in the tailoring division, kept mostly to himself, and reportedly requested books on mechanical design, escapology, and Victorian engineering. Some say he continued to draw locks on the walls of his cell, using tiny slivers of coal as pencil. In 1908, after serving his full sentence, Edwin was released. He was 48 years old. And then he vanished. No official record shows him returning to Nottinghamshire. Some speculated he emigrated. Others believed he died quietly under a false name in London or Glasgow. But a more persistent rumor passed along from constable to constable told of a rash of similarly clean burglaries cropping up in Sussex and Kent in the years that followed. Again, no broken windows, no forced locks, just absence. Was it Edwin, perhaps? But if it was, he left no journal behind this time, only silence. The psychology of the unseen. Modern criminologists occasionally reference the Blackshaw case as one of England's most peculiar non-violent burglars. Not for the number of crimes there were worse, not for the scale others stole far more, but for the motive. Dr. Hiram Latimer, a 20th century forensic psychologist, wrote, "What makes Edwin Blackshaw unique is not that he entered homes undetected. It's that he did so with reverence, like a man visiting a museum after hours. He studied, he documented, he didn't destroy, he watched, and that unnerves us more than violence ever could." Legacy in locks. Ironically, Edwin's legacy lived on not in crime reports, but in lock design. One of the entries in his journal included a sketch of a hypothetical lock that, despite its rudimentary form, bore early resemblances to what would later be known as anti-pick pin tumblers. A copy of the sketch now resides in the private archives of a UK security manufacturer. It's a bitter irony. The man who exposed the weakness of common locks unwittingly contributed to their future design. The shop today. Pudding Lane still exists. Edwin's shop, now a cafe, bears a small brass plaque at the back, mounted just above where the false wall once stood. It reads, "Here worked Edwin Blackshaw, cobbler and locksmith, a man who reminded us that every keyhole holds a secret." The current cafe owner keeps a replica of one of Edwin's handmade tools on display, framed under glass, not as a glorification of crime, but as a tribute to obsession, secrecy, and the invisible lives people live just beyond the threshold. A final entry. In the last page of his final journal, now archived in police custody, Edwin wrote something curious. It read, "There are locks within people too, and I have never found a tool sharp enough to open those." It was signed simply, E.B., and beneath it, a small ink sketch of a lock already open. Reflection. The case of Edwin Blackshaw reveals something uncomfortable about the human mind. The urge to see without being seen, to possess through observation, not ownership. In a time before cameras, before alarms, before digital security, what Edwin took from his victims was not wealth, but privacy. And that, in the long shadows of late Victorian England, was more terrifying than 1,000 smashed windows. He reminded the world that silence could be a form of violation, that even a quiet man with good hands and a modest trade could find his way into the most sacred spaces without ever leaving a mark. Story 2. The Pharmacist of Poison Hollow. In the sleepy hamlet of Crenshaw Hollow, population 412, the rhythm of life rarely changed. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, the town sat quiet beneath a canopy of maples and poplars. Its only real connection to the outside world, a narrow gravel road that twisted up through the hills. At the center of it all was a single, aging building. Devereux's Apothecary, a place where you could buy cough syrup, calamine lotion, and if you were on friendly enough terms, a few things not found in any medical ledger. Behind the wooden counter stood Thomas Devereux, a man of precise manners, few words, and meticulous notes. To most, he was the epitome of rural dependability. He knew everyone's ailments by name and dosage. He had studied chemistry briefly in Charleston, returned to care for his ailing mother, and never left. But what Crenshaw Hollow didn't know was that Thomas Devereux had begun experimenting with compounding in the back room of his shop, creating tinctures, powders, and oils based not solely on medical need, but on influence, control, and eventually, silence. A community of trust. In small towns, trust is currency, and Thomas had it in spades. The sheriff, an elderly man named Ray Tumlin, came by once a week for his arthritis salve. Miss Emma, the school teacher, swore by his homemade tonics for her migraines. And old Mrs. Hartley, who had long suffered from neuralgia, claimed Thomas's drops were the only thing that let her sleep through the night. He was, in many ways, the closest thing to a doctor the town had. The real doctor was 40 miles away and didn't take credit. What no one considered was that Thomas rarely got sick himself, rarely left the shop, rarely accepted visitors beyond business hours. And when the deaths began quiet, spaced apart, and medically explainable, no one looked behind the oak counter where rows of bottles stood, each labeled with Thomas's looping script. The first whisper. The first death was that of Mr. Elias Turner, a retired railway man who had long suffered from stomach ulcers. One Sunday morning, Elias was found slumped in his chair by the fire, his tea untouched, the house silent. The coroner attributed it to natural causes, internal bleeding, aggravated by stress. No one questioned it. Elias had been frail for years. The second was Annabelle Creedy, a midwife in her 60s, who died in her sleep after complaining of dizziness. She, too, had been struggling with high blood pressure and exhaustion. Both had been regular customers at the apothecary. But then again, who in Crenshaw Hollow was? It wasn't until the third death, a young, otherwise healthy man named Gavin Rusk, that murmurs began to ripple. Gavin had only come to Devereux Apothecary once. He had a toothache and asked for clove oil. A few days later, he was dead from what the coroner called an unexpected respiratory failure. Still, no alarm bells rang. Until Gavin's sister, Caroline, came back to town for the funeral and started asking questions. Caroline Rusk's suspicion. Caroline had lived in Lexington for years, but she had grown up in Crenshaw Hollow. She remembered the apothecary from childhood, remembered Thomas Devereux's gentle way with measuring spoons and brown paper wrapping. But she also remembered something else. Her mother had once warned her never to take anything too strong from him. "He's precise," her mother had said, "but he's not always predictable." After Gavin's death, Caroline returned to the shop under the guise of picking up menthol balm. She asked Thomas casually about what he had given her brother. "Just clove oil," he replied, "with a drop of my homemade carrier. Nothing toxic." She thanked him and left, but something felt wrong. She took the small bottle still full, still capped, and later handed it to a friend who worked in toxicology at the university lab in Lexington. The report came back within days. It wasn't just clove oil. It was infused with digitoxin, a powerful cardiac glycoside derived from foxglove, used in heart medications but lethal in unregulated doses. Gavin's bottle was laced with it. Going to the sheriff. Caroline returned to Crenshaw Hollow immediately. She went straight to Sheriff Tumlin. The old man listened politely. He nodded. He even wrote down the name of the chemical, but he was not moved. Thomas Devereux is a respected man, he said. If your brother had anything toxic in his system, the coroner would have found it. When Caroline showed him the lab report, he frowned. Out-of-state lab, no chain of custody, and that bottle could have come from anywhere. She left his office furious and afraid. She began telling others, quietly at first, then more directly. That's when she learned something chilling. Elias Turner had also recently switched to a new digestive tincture. Annabelle Creedy had praised a new herbal blend for sleep. Each concoction came from Devereux's hands, each tailored, each deadly. Still, the sheriff refused to act without more evidence. The pharmacist calmed. Meanwhile, Thomas Devereux went about his business without pause. He heard the rumors, surely. Caroline's return, the hushed gossip in the grocer's queue. But his expression never changed. He still opened at 8:00 a.m. sharp, still handed out his salves, his balms, his powdered camphor. He even began developing a new cough tonic for the children, flavored with licorice root. In the back room, however, his notebooks grew darker. One entry read, "Dosage must be smaller next time. Symptoms presented too early. Suspicion is a virus I cannot control." Another, "She is persistent. The sister must assess whether her absence from the hollow is worth restoring equilibrium." They weren't medical notes anymore. They were strategy. An unlikely ally. Caroline's growing frustration found an unexpected ally in Reverend Paul Lindley, the local pastor. Lindley had long been skeptical of Devereux, not out of hatred, but concern. Years ago, he had asked Thomas for help treating a parishioner's melancholy. Thomas provided an herbal mixture that left the man nearly catatonic for days. Lindley had never mentioned it publicly. But after hearing Caroline's story, he began going through the death records. He noticed something startling. In the last 4 years, Crenshaw Hollow's mortality rate, typically low, had more than doubled. Most deaths had official explanations, but at least 9 involved people who had visited the apothecary shortly before their decline. Still, there was no hard evidence, only shadows. The 4th death. Then came the death of Sheriff Tumlin. He collapsed at home in his chair after drinking his nightly pain relief tea, a blend Thomas had made him for over a decade. This time, Caroline demanded an autopsy by an external agency. She used her own savings to pay for a private lab. The results were undeniable. Lethal levels of aconitine, also known as monkshood or wolfsbane. Aconitine is a deadly neurotoxin that causes heart arrhythmias and paralysis. Devereux's mixture had been laced with it. Now, even the local magistrate could no longer ignore the evidence. A town in panic. With the sheriff gone, panic quietly swept through Crenshaw Hollow. People stopped going to the apothecary. Some discarded the contents of their medicine cabinets. Others left town altogether, afraid of what might be hiding in the amber vials still in their homes. But Thomas didn't run. Instead, he stayed behind the counter, waiting. When state investigators arrived with a warrant, he didn't flinch. He handed them the shop keys and asked only one question. "Will you be thorough?" They were. In the back room, they found rows of jars and unmarked containers, some labeled with chemical names, others with botanical terms that hadn't been in common use since the 18th century. They found a ledger neat, dated, cross-referenced with symptoms, names, and outcomes. And in a locked cabinet, they found a series of dried plant specimens carefully sealed in wax paper. Foxglove, monkshood, belladonna. Poisons, all cultivated with care. The final vial. One final discovery haunted investigators most. A single bottle, unlabeled, sat in a velvet-lined box beneath the cabinet. Inside was a clear liquid, and beneath the bottle, a note written in Devereux's unmistakable handwriting. For myself, when the cure is no longer needed. But when tested, the bottle contained distilled water. He hadn't planned to die. He had planned to watch. Unresolved. Why did Thomas Devereux do it? There was no fortune to be made, no known feud, no traceable ideology. His journals hinted at an almost clinical detachment death, as a form of treatment for what he once called a sickly town. Was it control, delusion, or did he, in some twisted way, see himself as a caretaker choosing who suffered, who found relief, and who did? And most chilling of all, were there others who knew? Several of his compounds were traced to neighboring counties. Some had Devereux's label, others didn't. Could his reach have gone further than anyone suspected? And what about the entries in his ledger, marked only with numbers, not names? When investigators finally sat down to analyze Thomas Devereux's ledger, it felt less like reading a pharmacist's notes and more like decrypting a code. His meticulous handwriting covered over 200 pages entries that spanned more than a decade, tracking clients, formulas, observed outcomes, and chillingly, notations that seemed entirely unrelated to medicine. Some names were underlined, others were circled, but the most disturbing entries were marked with nothing more than a simple X or a dash. No symptoms, no dosage, no follow-up. And beside many of those anonymous marks, a date of death. What began as a case of suspicious medicine now felt like something far more elaborate, an orchestrated long-term experiment with the people of Crenshaw Hollow as its unwitting subjects. Hidden codes in plain sight. 2 state investigators from Charleston, Bethany Rayner and Paul Danton, were brought in specifically to study the ledger. They'd seen drug rings, compounding frauds, even pharmacists laundering opioid sales. But this was something else. Rayner described it later as part chemistry, part journal, part confession, except the confessor didn't think he was guilty. It read like a man documenting weather patterns, except the weather was human lives. They began cross-referencing the ledger with local death certificates, prescriptions, and coroner reports. The pattern grew unmistakable. Clients whose visits ended with a symbol, particularly an X, tended to die within weeks. Some were suffering from genuine illnesses. Others, like Gavin Rusk, were in good health. Of the 137 total symbols logged in the ledger, 48 corresponded to confirmed deaths. Of those, at least 21 showed evidence of toxins once re-examined. An internal code. With the help of a linguistic analyst from a state university, Rayner and Danton began interpreting some of the shorthand. LVN likely stood for liver non-responsive. Delta RSBK/BT could mean change in respect/behavior toward Thomas. RC-Prov appeared multiple times and was theorized to mean refused compound provoked. This last one, RC-Prov, was often followed by an X within 2 weeks. It suggested a disturbing theory. Thomas was not only monitoring who used his compounds, but also judging who deserved their effects. And when that relationship turned, he retaliated. Even more troubling was the lack of remorse in the writing. The tone was clinical, detached. One entry read, "Patient continues to express doubt. Seeks second opinion in Charleston. RC-Prov. Expect outcome soon. Do not increase belladonna yet." That patient, a woman named Clara Ridge, died from stroke complications 6 days later. Her bottle, when exhumed from family belongings, tested positive for elevated levels of atropine. Poison as a philosophy. In a hearing before the state grand jury, prosecutor Elaine Madsen made a chilling point. Thomas Devereux did not act out of sudden rage, financial desperation, or psychosis. He acted from a position of belief. He believed he had the authority to decide who lived comfortably, who suffered, and who did not deserve to go on living at all. His ledger wasn't just documentation. It was a belief system one built quietly over years, cloaked in the anonymity of a respected trade. Devereux had found a loophole in the moral order. Trusted, licensed, and unmonitored, he shaped life and death with nothing more than a tincture bottle. And no one, not the town, not the law, noticed until it was too late. The case builds. With increasing public attention, the state assembled a multi-agency team to prepare a criminal case against Devereux. Charges included 21 counts of murder, 28 counts of criminal negligence causing death, multiple counts of unlawful distribution of controlled substances, tampering with medical records, and labeling fraud. But behind the legalese, the truth was simpler and darker. Thomas Devereux had spent over a decade playing God in a town too trusting, too isolated, and too slow to see the storm building behind the pharmacy's closed doors. Caroline Rusk speaks. At a public forum held in Charleston, Caroline Rusk, who had exposed the first toxin, gave a quiet, composed statement. People say Crenshaw Hollow was blind, that we should have seen the signs. But when someone wears the face of trust for so long, it becomes a mask you don't question. Devereux didn't just hurt us. He broke our understanding of safety, of healing. He used our faith in him as the very weapon to destroy us. Her statement went viral in Appalachian communities, sparking widespread reevaluations of unregulated pharmacies and home compounders in rural areas. Suddenly, people across the region were asking hard questions. And many small-town pharmacists, some entirely innocent, found themselves facing audits and suspicion. The ripple effect had begun. Devereux' silence. Throughout the investigation, Devereux remained composed and cooperative, but said almost nothing of substance. He did not ask for a lawyer until 2 weeks into his detainment. He offered no confession, no plea. When asked why he had created so many unregulated compounds, he replied, "They asked for remedies, I provided them." When asked about the coded entries, he simply smiled. Everyone has a system. Mine was simply effective. He neither denied nor admitted to administering poisons. In fact, when presented with hard evidence, he would only ever say, "That's what you believe." It wasn't defiance, it was detachment. A final search reveals more. Weeks after the initial raid, investigators returned to Devereux' family home, a house he inherited from his mother, tucked up against the edge of a wooded ridge outside town. There in the root cellar, they made one final discovery. A second ledger locked in a steel box, older and more cryptic. This one went back 18 years before his official pharmacy license. It included names of people long dead, some of whom were buried without autopsies, deemed to have died from old age, natural decline, or accidents. The codes were more primitive, but some matched the entries in the newer journal. The implication was devastating. Thomas Devereux had likely been testing and experimenting years before anyone knew. Crenshaw Hollow's death toll might have been far higher than the state originally estimated. Was there a purpose? As the case expanded, so did the question. What was Devereux' endgame? Was it purely power? Was it a nihilistic pursuit of control? Was it a response to trauma? Or did he truly believe he was acting as a moral filter for a town he considered unwell? Forensic psychologists debated the question for months. Some likened him to historical poisoners like Harold Shipman, others to methodical cult leaders who viewed control as an extension of care. One psychiatrist suggested Devereux may have suffered from delusional altruism, a rare condition where a person justifies harm under the belief they are protecting a greater good. But the truth remains unknown. Devereux never admitted guilt, never explained motive. When asked during a pre-trial interview if he regretted any decisions, He paused and said, "Some patients don't heal, they just linger." Trial in waiting. Devereux's formal trial was scheduled for early 1910 to be held in Charleston under heavy security and public scrutiny. As of late 1909, he remained in state custody, held in a secure psychiatric observation wing. The state continued to exhume bodies and retest medicine bottles. Crenshaw Hollow, meanwhile, entered an uneasy silence. A new pharmacist took over the apothecary, but many in town now drove 40 miles to get even basic medicine. No one trusted the amber vials anymore. And yet, there remain at least 22 names in Devereux's ledger that investigators have never matched to any known resident. No birth records, no death certificates, no medical charts. Who were they? Transients, travelers passing through the hub, or people from beyond the town, connected to Devereux through some other network? Were there more deaths unnoticed, unrecorded? Could Devereux's reach have extended beyond Appalachia? And if so, how far? When the people of Crenshaw Hollow heard that Thomas Devereux would finally stand trial in Charleston, they were divided, some desperate for justice, others shaken to their core, still not ready to believe the man who once mixed their cough syrup was capable of orchestrating one of the most insidious medical crimes in Appalachian history. The court labeled the case simply, State of West Virginia versus Thomas E. Devereux. But those who followed the proceedings came to know it by another name, the Poison Ledger Trial. It was not merely a case of unlawful compounding or medical negligence. It was a question of intent. Had Thomas Devereux knowingly, systematically poisoned dozens of people under the guise of treatment? And perhaps the harder question, what if he believed he was healing them all along? The charges. By the time the trial commenced in January 1910, Devereux faced 21 counts of first-degree murder, 6 counts of attempted murder, multiple charges of unlawful distribution of toxic substances, medical fraud and endangerment, forgery of pharmaceutical documentation. The prosecution focused on 6 core deaths where forensic evidence was strongest, and where Devereux's notes clearly corresponded with the patient's timelines, and the presence of toxins such as aconitine, atropine, digitoxin, and strychnine. The trial was expected to last 3 weeks. It went on for 10. The prosecution's argument. Lead prosecutor Elaine Madsen opened her argument with a chilling statement. This is not a trial about medicine. It is a trial about power. A man used his position, his community's trust, and his mastery of chemistry to become a silent executioner over years. Quietly, calculatedly, patiently, with every death he grew more precise. Witness after witness took the stand. Caroline Rusk recounted her brother's sudden decline after taking clove oil, enhanced by Devereux. Forensic toxicologists explain how minute, undetectable dosages could accumulate fatally over days. Historians of pharmacology testified to the rarity and danger of some of the compounds used. Clergy and townsfolk spoke to the eerie precision of his work and how patients felt watched, even after they stopped taking his remedies. Devereux's own ledger deemed admissible was displayed page by page, including sections with coded phrases like RC-Prov, Delta RSPK, and the now infamous X entries beside victims' names. One expert described it as a professional death catalog disguised as pharmacy notes. The defense's strategy. Devereux's court-appointed defense attorney, Malcolm Sipes, was competent but overwhelmed. His only real strategy was reasonable doubt, arguing that the toxin-laced bottles could have been tampered with after the fact. Some of the plant-based compounds occurred naturally and could have been misidentified. His client had no direct motive, no inheritance, no extortion, no known vendettas. The ledger, while cryptic, was open to interpretation and lacked explicit admission of intent to kill. He also leaned heavily into Devereux's mental state, calling on a psychologist to argue that Thomas may have been suffering from a delusional personality disorder rooted in isolation, obsession with control, and a misguided sense of moral duty. When asked directly on the stand if he believed his remedies had caused harm, Thomas Devereux replied, "If someone fails to heal, perhaps they were not meant to. I only ever gave them what they asked for." It was the only sentence he spoke under oath. Public reaction. The courtroom was full. Each day press, scholars, victims' families, and even residents from neighboring towns. The atmosphere was hushed, electric, like something sacred had been desecrated. The Charleston Gazette wrote, "We expected a monster. We got a man in a vest with ink-stained fingers and calm eyes, and somehow that's worse." In Crenshaw Hollow, fear turned to anger. The apothecary remained shuttered. The new pharmacist who replaced every bottle and compound in the building found a small cloth pouch hidden in the floorboards. Inside were dried seeds, monkshood. He turned them over to authorities, then closed the shop permanently. "No one wants medicine here anymore," he said. Verdict. On March 3, 1910, after 16 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on 17 counts of murder. Guilty on all charges of criminal poisoning. Guilty on all regulatory and fraud charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served at Mount Olive Correctional Complex, under medical observation. He showed no emotion. Prison years. In prison, Devereux was kept under close psychiatric care. He refused interviews, refused visitors. According to medical staff, he spent most of his time in silence, reading chemistry books and writing in small notebooks. He was given paper only under supervision. Every page was reviewed. One doctor noted, "He didn't deny what he had done, but he never acknowledged it either. It was as though his world existed parallel to ours, a place where death was simply a side effect of precision." In 1915, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. He died a year later from complications. He left behind a single note in his cell. "A pure dose is not always the right one, but it is always honest." Long-term consequences. The Devereux case triggered sweeping regulatory reform across rural Appalachia and the broader Southern pharmacy network. Mandatory audits were introduced for all rural compounders. Apothecaries had to submit compound formulas to a regional registry. The West Virginia Board of Pharmacy began requiring psychological evaluations for isolated practitioners. The case was cited in medical ethics courses well into the 21st century as a warning. Knowledge, when coupled with isolation and control, can quietly cross into the realm of cruelty. The legacy of the ledger. Perhaps the most enduring artifact was Devereux's ledger, now kept under restricted access at the West Virginia State Archives. Scholars and criminologists still study it, not because they seek to glorify what he did, but because it is a mirror, a reflection of what happens when trust, authority, and silence conspire. Some researchers have suggested that Devereux was not the only one, that other rural pharmacists in other hollows, with no oversight and total community trust, may have acted similarly. But Devereux was the only one meticulous and obsessive enough to document it all. Final reflection. Thomas Devereux did not kill for pleasure. He did not kill for profit. He killed for control. In a town that relied on his guidance, he quietly redrew the line between life and death, one bottle at a time, one patient at a time, always believing he knew better. The case asks a question that still lingers in the soft valleys of West Virginia. How many lives must a man alter before he's no longer a healer, but something else entirely. Story 3. The Counterfeit Milkman of Brooklyn. The year was 1903, and the streets of Brooklyn's Red Hook district were waking to the same morning sounds they always did: iron-rimmed wagon wheels creaking over cobblestone, the clip-clop of horses' hooves, and the soft clatter of glass milk bottles being set on stoops. For most households, the arrival of the milkman marked the day's beginning. But what the people of Red Hook didn't realize was that one milkman's route, neat, reliable, and familiar, carried with it not nourishment, but deception. Because the man behind the handlebar mustache and pressed white cap wasn't who he claimed to be. His name was Elliot Merrick, and he wasn't a licensed dairyman. In fact, Elliot Merrick wasn't Elliot Merrick at all. A man with a wagon and a plan. The real Elliot Merrick had died in a factory fire in Queens the year before, a quiet tragedy buried on page 4 of the Brooklyn Eagle. But before his death, Merrick had delivered milk for a small, independent creamery. His face and name were known only to a few dozen clients. His route was stable. His employer, elderly and hard of hearing, kept few records. So when a man appeared weeks later using Merrick's name, pushing a nearly identical wagon, no one asked questions. He wore the same cap, knew the homes, spoke with the same regional accent. But this new Merrick wasn't just impersonating a milkman, he was flooding Brooklyn with adulterated dairy, mixed in a grimy basement just blocks from the East River. A dangerous industry. To understand the crime, you must understand the time. In 1903, milk was dangerous. Before pasteurization became common, unregulated milk was responsible for thousands of illnesses: typhoid, tuberculosis, and dysentery among them. Poor refrigeration and storage turned milk sour quickly, and profit-hungry distributors were notorious for stretching milk with water, chalk, plaster, gelatin, or even formaldehyde. New York City had passed its first milk safety ordinances only a few years earlier, but enforcement was inconsistent. A man with a wagon, clean bottles, and a practiced smile could operate freely for weeks, sometimes months, without oversight. That's exactly what Merrick did. The mixing basement. A pair of dockworkers were the first to grow suspicious. They lived in a boarding house on Van Brunt Street, and both fell violently ill within days of one another. They traced their sickness to the same thing: a bottle of milk left on the stoop by a new milkman, Merrick, with a white horse named Poppy. But they weren't alone. In just under 3 weeks, 14 households reported stomach cramps, nausea, or fever. Most recovered. One did not: a 6-month-old infant who died 2 days after feeding from a bottle mixed with the morning's milk. An autopsy revealed the child had ingested high levels of borax, a common preservative at the time, but in sufficient quantity, toxic to infants. City health officials were called in. They launched a quiet investigation, not wanting to incite panic in the crowded borough. The real identity. Using route maps and bottle markings, inspectors tracked Merrick to a rented basement unit beneath a butcher shop. What they found was shocking. Dozens of reused milk bottles unwashed and still bearing others' logos. A rusted metal barrel used for mixing. Industrial quantities of watered-down skim, starch, and preservatives. 2 crates of empty bottles labeled Hudson Dairy, a company that had gone bankrupt a year prior. But Merrick was nowhere to be found. It took another week before investigators connected him to his true identity. Francis "Frankie DeLeo, a former butcher's apprentice and small-time conman with a history of petty fraud. Who was Frankie DeLeo? Frankie DeLeo had grown up in Brooklyn's working-class Italian neighborhoods, bouncing between jobs. He was smart, uneducated, and obsessively observant. His first known crime had been as a teen, selling lard as butter, dyed yellow with marigold flowers. He'd never been caught for that, and over the years, he refined his methods, learning how businesses worked, where record-keeping was lax, how branding and delivery could be mimicked. When Elliot Merrick died in that fire, Frankie saw opportunity. He bought a retired horse, repainted a wagon, and began running the same morning route, only he didn't get his milk from a creamery. He got it from anywhere he could. Leaky dairies on Long Island, back alley suppliers in Queens, even rejected shipments from distributors across the river in Manhattan. He'd cut it, treat it, and sell it fresh by dawn. To the eye it was milk, cold, white, and bottled. To the gut it was poison, the cover of familiarity. Part of what made Frankie so effective was his understanding of routine. People trusted milkmen because they were familiar. They arrived at the same time, knocked the same knock, even smiled the same smile. Few people questioned their deliveries, and fewer still inspected the milk closely, especially in poorer neighborhoods, where options were limited and complaints meant nothing. Frankie leaned into that. He used names of children he'd overheard to build trust. He marked his bottles with chalk to appear more official. He sometimes left free bottles at new homes to win customers. His fraud worked not because of chemistry, but because of psychology. The baby's death changes everything. The death of the infant, Rosalie McKendry, changed the tone of the investigation entirely. Her mother had been vocal, writing a desperate letter to the Brooklyn Eagle pleading for answers. The newspaper ran a short story. "Is your milkman licensed?" That headline sparked outrage. Soon, more families came forward. Illnesses that had once been dismissed as summer fevers or food poisoning were now re-examined. In total, over 60 residents were believed to have consumed adulterated milk from Merrick. And then, weeks later, Frankie resurfaced. Arrest in New Jersey. He was caught not in Brooklyn, but in Newark, New Jersey, trying to rent a new horse and wagon under the name Hugh Winslow. His crime, attempting to pass counterfeit health inspection papers. But when the stable owner grew suspicious, police were called. Frankie's fingerprints, already on file for a prior forgery case, sealed his fate. He was extradited to New York in chains. When reporters asked why he did it, he simply laughed. "It's milk. People stretch it all the time. I just stretched it a little further." But the investigation wasn't over. City officials still had unanswered questions. Had Frankie acted alone? How many suppliers knew their milk was being altered and resold? Was there a larger network of counterfeit milkmen operating in other boroughs? The Department of Health launched a broader inspection of every milk route in Brooklyn, uncovering other infractions: dirty bottles, undercooled deliveries, and mislabeled cream. But Frankie's case was the worst. Still, even with mounting evidence, it wasn't clear whether his crimes amounted to fraud, manslaughter, or something far more difficult to prove: premeditated poisoning. He was headed for trial. And his defense: he claimed no one ever proved the milk was deadly before he sold it. By the spring of 1904, the arrest of Frankie DeLeo, alias Elliot Merrick, had become front-page news. What began as a quiet investigation into a few sour bottles had grown into a citywide reckoning with the dark underbelly of the dairy trade. In courtrooms, in newspapers, and around every breakfast table in Brooklyn, a single question lingered. How many people had been poisoned by a man in a milkman's cap? The trial of the century for milk. The courthouse on Adams Street overflowed with onlookers. It wasn't often that a simple deliveryman stood accused of manslaughter, fraud, and reckless endangerment. The prosecution framed the case not just as a betrayal of trust, but as an attack on public health. Lead prosecutor Henry J. Wilcox, a hard-nosed reformist known for his crusades against food adulteration, opened with the line, "This is not about milk. It is about murder by the teaspoon." He laid out the timeline: DeLeo's assumption of Merrick's identity, the illegal acquisition of dairy remnants from substandard creameries, his creation of counterfeit milk in a Red Hook basement, the subsequent illnesses and death of infant Rosalie McKendry. Wilcox described Frankie's operation as industrial-scale deceit, arguing that every glass bottle delivered under the Merrick name was a potential weapon placed on a child's breakfast table. The bottles that spoke. Central to the prosecution's case was the physical evidence. Milk samples, recovered from homes and stored by city inspectors, revealed dangerously high levels of borax, formaldehyde, and starch used to mask spoilage and imitate the thickness of cream. Bottles etched with phony dairy labels had been found in DeLeo's rented cellar, along with the crude mixing tools. A ledger, smudged and water-stained, included delivery addresses and dosage notations, amounts added, routes covered, even handwritten notes like thicker blend hyacinth, kids like sweet. The prosecution also brought in Dr. Arthur Meisel, a food chemist from Columbia University, who testified that even adults would have experienced gastrointestinal distress from the compounds used. For infants, the result would be fatal within hours. The witnesses. Mrs. Alice McKendry, Rosalie's mother, testified with a shaking voice. I gave her that milk because I trusted it. I trusted the man who wore the cap. I didn't think something so clean could kill. Others followed. A dock worker who lost consciousness for 36 hours after drinking the milk straight from the bottle. A schoolteacher who reported using Merrick, milk for cocoa, in her classroom, which led to 3 students falling violently ill. Even fellow milkmen testified, expressing outrage that DeLeo had tainted the profession's reputation. Frankie's defense. Frankie DeLeo's court-appointed attorney, Morris Kahn, knew the odds were against him. But he tried anyway. He argued that milk adulteration was widespread at the time DeLeo was merely a small fish in a polluted pond. None of the substances were banned outright at the time, only discouraged. The prosecution couldn't definitively prove causation in the infant's death without exhumation, which the family refused. Frankie himself showed little remorse. On the stand, when asked if he knew his milk could cause harm, he said, I drank it myself some mornings, didn't die. When pressed, he added, people get sick all the time in this city. I didn't make the streets dirty, I just made the milk stretch. Public backlash and riots. Outside the courthouse, the public sentiment was anything but forgiving. After a second child fell ill, though survived, from leftover milk in a discarded bottle, parents took to the streets. In front of the courthouse, a group of working-class mothers chanted, "Death for the milkman, death for the lies." A full riot broke out in Cobble Hill, where 2 dairies were vandalized despite having no connection to DeLeo. City police responded with mounted officers and batons. At least a dozen arrests were made. The mayor of New York, under pressure from press and public, promised immediate regulatory reform. The press coined the scandal the Brooklyn Bottle Affair, a quiet scandal with loud consequences. Behind the noise and fury, a quieter investigation was unfolding. City inspectors had begun reviewing every milk supplier in Brooklyn, uncovering a tangled network of corruption. At least 3 dairy owners were arrested for selling spoiled product to unlicensed vendors. A city inspector was fired for taking bribes to overlook spoilage in DeLeo's supplier crates. A creamer in Queens, long suspected of laundering unsold milk from local farms, was shut down. Frankie DeLeo, it seemed, was the face of a larger, dirtier truth. The verdict. On June 6, 1904, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury found Frankie DeLeo guilty of second-degree manslaughter in the death of Rosalie McKendry, guilty of fraud and reckless endangerment, guilty of operating an unlicensed business with intent to deceive. He was sentenced to 20 years in Sing Sing prison. As he was led away, One reporter noted that DeLeo turned to the courtroom and grinned. "Still better than working in a butcher's shop," he said. Reform and reflection. In the wake of the trial, New York City instituted a series of sweeping reforms, including mandatory pasteurization for all milk entering the 5 boroughs, licensing and inspection requirements for every dairy route, weekly milk testing by city health departments, the formation of the Milk Commission, a precursor to national food safety standards. Milk wagons were now required to bear identification numbers, and customers were encouraged to report irregularities. The era of trust-based delivery was ending. Regulation had arrived. What became of Frankie DeLeo? Frankie served 13 years of his sentence before being released for good behavior in 1917. He changed his name again and disappeared. Some say he moved west. One rumor claimed he reappeared in St. Louis, selling canned soups from a cart. Another traced a man of similar build to Chicago, caught tampering with barrels of vinegar. But no arrest was ever confirmed. His legacy, however, remained in every sealed bottle on a grocery shelf. A glass bottle, a grim reminder. The McKendries never sued the city. They moved away, changed addresses, and never spoke to the press again. But a cracked glass bottle, one of Frankie's, sits today in the New York City Health Department archives, labeled simply, Specimen 14, Brooklyn, 1903, fatal. And it reminds every food safety officer that not all poison comes with a warning label. Sometimes it comes at sunrise, clinking softly on the front step, wearing a clean white cap and a smile. Story 4. The Small-Town Undertaker and the Vanishing Wills. Whitlock, Illinois, was the kind of place that didn't appear on most maps unless you were specifically looking for it. Tucked among the cornfields and overgrown railroad tracks of the Midwestern prairie, it held fewer than 2,000 residents, most of whom had known one another for generations. The town had one diner, one church, one sheriff, and only one funeral home. That home, a modest stone building with ivy along the southern wall, bore a simple brass sign near the front porch. Bramble and Sons Mortuary, Est, 1911. But in truth, there were no sons. There hadn't been for decades. The man who greeted mourners and prepared the dead was Frederick Bramble, a tall, soft-spoken man in his early 60s, known for his impeccable posture, calming voice, and the way he remembered every name, every date, and according to some, every secret that passed through Whitlock. He wore black even when off-duty. He never married, and he lived alone in the rooms above the mortuary where the curtains never opened and the clocks never ticked. A reputation built on ritual. Frederick Bramble ran his funeral home like a cathedral. Services were precisely timed. Flowers were always arranged symmetrically. Obituaries were typed on a 1924 Underwood typewriter. And the deceased, always impeccably prepared, looked more like wax figures than people who had once breathed the same humid air of central Illinois. He spoke in low tones, never hurried, and insisted that every family receive space for grief. Over time, he became a fixture of the town, not just its caretaker of death, but something closer to a custodian of legacy. He handled not only burials, but often helped families organize paperwork, guide them through wills, and even offered to store vital documents in his fireproof safe until the estate process unfolded. No one questioned this. After all, Bramble had a face that made you feel like everything was in order. The first whisper. In September of 1979, the children of Lena Cartwright, a retired school teacher, gathered at Bramble and Sons for a small service. Lena had died of natural causes, aged 84, leaving behind a house, a modest savings account, and according to her daughter, a will filed with Bramble's office just 2 years earlier. That will named all 3 children as equal beneficiaries. But when the estate was opened, The family was shocked to discover a different document, one that left the house solely to a local historical society, a group Lena had occasionally volunteered with, but never mentioned as an heir. Even stranger, the handwriting appeared to be hers, but the signature was missing the distinctive loop she always made on her capital L. A pattern emerges. Lena's children complained to Sheriff Howard Bixby, a man as slow-moving as the town he patrolled. He noted the complaint but explained that if a newer will existed, it superseded the older version. Unless they could prove forgery or coercion, the court would respect the most recent document. But she gave us copies of the old one, her son insisted, the one that left everything to us. Bramble had no record of it. When asked, he blinked slowly and replied, "If there was such a document, it is no longer here. My safe only holds current files." 3 months later, a similar complaint surfaced, this time from the nephew of Albert Nell, a retired grain elevator operator. Nell, too, had allegedly created a will leaving his land to family, but the filed version showed all assets left to a small Presbyterian mission in Iowa that no one had ever heard of. The will again was typed, precise, without a single spelling error. And it too had passed through Bramble's hands. Enter a stranger. It was a young lawyer from Springfield, Emily Varick, who began connecting the dots. Her firm had recently inherited a case involving a trust dispute tied to a Whitlock estate. As she dug deeper, she noticed something odd. Several wills from Whitlock filed in the last 10 years bore near-identical formatting, used the same typewriter font, and included language more common in New England estates than in rural Illinois. All the wills had been typed. All came through Bramble's mortuary. All involved last-minute changes that redirected inheritance away from families, often to obscure organizations or individuals with no clear connection. She flagged 6 such cases, then 9. By the 12th case, she contacted state investigators. The vanishing originals. Investigators visited Whitlock under the pretense of conducting a routine audit of independent will custodians. When they arrived at Bramble's mortuary, he welcomed them with warm tea and quiet formality. They asked for access to his safe. He produced the key without hesitation. Inside were dozens of folders, each labeled meticulously by name and year. But many had been purged of earlier documents wills written prior to the final versions, which had often redirected inheritance to third-party trusts, churches, or in some cases, to Bramble himself for custodial maintenance of burial plots. He showed no alarm, no evasion. If anything, he appeared expectant. "Families often change their minds," he said. "It's not uncommon for a will to be revised late in life. People seek simplicity as the end approaches." But when asked to produce typing samples, he guided them to the Underwood typewriter in his office, the same one used to prepare all the suspicious documents. A grim equation. Forensic examiners matched the typewriter's imperfections, a faint misalignment on lowercase e, and a light smear on capital G, to at least 14 questionable wills. Handwriting analysis revealed traced signatures in 3 cases. Investigators also found a small locked drawer in Bramble's desk containing practice sheets for forged signatures, obituaries clipped from out-of-state newspapers, receipts for donations made in cash to organizations that could not be located, and a ledger containing brief notations next to decedents, names cryptic entries like "no air smooth" or "daughter estranged safe." The conclusion became inescapable. Frederick Bramble had been altering wills for years, perhaps decades, redirecting wealth under the veil of clerical assistance. But why? That was the question no one could answer. Frederick Bramble lived modestly. He didn't drive a new car. He took no vacations. The mortuary was kept in the same shape it had been in since the 1940s. The stolen money wasn't lavishly spent, it was parked, donated, or untraceably cashed out. Had he done it for wealth, for control, for some sense of moral redistribution? When asked, he said, "Not all families deserve the fruits of a life. Sometimes a clean break is better." It wasn't quite a confession, but it was enough. The town's reckoning. When the news broke, Whitlock recoiled in disbelief. People whispered in the pews. Obituaries were reread with suspicion. Distant cousins returned, asking for records. Bank managers were pressed for account statements. And families, some long gone from the town, began demanding exhumations, court filings, and civil suits. The death toll wasn't in bodies. It was in paper. When Frederick Bramble was officially charged in March of 1980, the indictment listed fraud, document tampering, abuse of position, and conspiracy to misappropriate estate funds. But in truth, the legal language barely captured the depth of the betrayal. Whitlock wasn't just dealing with a criminal, it was confronting the collapse of a social contract. For decades, Bramble hadn't just buried the dead, he'd quietly rewritten their legacies. And he had done it in such a gentle, measured way that no one had thought to question it. The investigation widens. With state investigators now firmly entrenched in Whitlock, they began conducting full estate audits on every family served by Bramble and Sons mortuary between 1962 and 1979. They soon uncovered a consistent pattern. Families would present early wills, often with clear beneficiaries. In each case, the version submitted for probate had been retyped, bearing slight but significant changes, omitting heirs, redirecting assets, or modifying trusts. The replacement wills were almost always typed on Bramble's 1924 Underwood and filed just weeks or days before death. Frequently, the beneficiaries listed in these altered documents were small nonprofits, obscure religious organizations, or shell custodial accounts, labeled with vague names like Prairie Legacy Initiative or the Founders Fund. It didn't take long for the investigators to realize that some of these beneficiaries did not exist. And those that did, many were PO boxes or pass-through accounts controlled by anonymous managers, entities that led, ultimately, back to Frederick Bramble. The money trail. The Illinois State Financial Commission began digging into Bramble's banking history. What they found stunned them. Although Bramble had lived simply maintaining an old home, driving a rusting Buick, eating alone at the diner, he had quietly funneled money into diversified investment accounts using trust proxies. One account held $412,000 in municipal bonds. Another, under the name Heritage Administrative Services, held real estate deeds for 2 apartment buildings in Decatur. A third was a brokerage account that had gone untouched for 7 years, but held over $300,000 in compounding interest. In total, authorities traced over $1.7 million in redirected inheritance, funds a staggering sum for a man who charged $850 for a full-service burial. When asked why he had never touched the money, Bramble replied, "It wasn't for spending, it was for safekeeping." Families respond. The emotional impact on families was devastating. The Cartwrights, who believed they would inherit the family farmhouse, had sold their own home to cover medical bills after Lena's death, believing they'd receive the house shortly. Now, they lived in a rented trailer outside town. The Nell family, stripped of 20 acres of farmland, had unknowingly paid property taxes for years before discovering the land had been red-idled under a sham trust. One elderly man, Thomas Greeley, broke down in court while describing how he had watched Bramble comfort his wife during her final days, only to learn that Bramble had forged her name on a will hours after her passing. Civil suits flooded the local courthouse. Whitlock became, in the span of months, A town in legal turmoil. A chilling routine. As part of discovery, prosecutors gained access to Bramble's personal journals, leather-bound books stacked neatly on his shelves. Inside were notes that revealed just how systematic the fraud had become. Code names for recurring patterns, e.g. W childless equals widowed with no children. Ardelaide equals religious clients with slow families. Detailed entries on family dynamics, including notes like, nephew greedy tried to move her into home. Document change justified. Lists of handwriting practice, he copied signatures of clients dozens of times, working from canceled checks or old letters. One entry, dated June 1977, read, Mr. Stokes has 2 sons, neither visit. Left him with final rights alone. Reassigned trust to local literacy fund. No regrets. There was no rage, no vindictiveness. Only what seemed to be cold moral accounting, as if Bramble saw himself not as a thief, but a quiet corrector of wrongs, a curator of justice in the space between life and death. The psychology behind the quiet forger. Forensic psychologists brought in during pretrial evaluation determined that Bramble likely suffered from a personality disorder marked by grandiose morality and control obsession. He didn't act impulsively. He didn't exhibit antisocial traits. Rather, his behavior aligned with what one expert described as undiagnosed messianic delusion in a low drama, high-precision individual. He genuinely believed his judgment was superior to that of families. Unlike typical financial criminals, Bramble did not use deception for material gain. Instead, he redirected estates in line with his private sense of fairness. If an heir had a criminal record, Bramble cut them out. If children failed to attend a funeral, Bramble altered the distribution. If an elderly widow left everything to a televangelist, Bramble corrected the document to fund the local library. He wasn't trying to get rich. He was trying to reshape moral history one signature at a time. The courtroom spectacle. The trial began in the fall of 1981, held in Springfield for fear that Whitlock's jury pool was too contaminated by local opinion. Court proceedings lasted nearly 3 months. Bramble remained eerily calm through it all. His demeanor never cracked. He listened to accusations of forgery, fraud, and betrayal with the same expression he used when reading scripture aloud at funerals. His defense team argued that most clients trusted him to help update documents, that some signatures could have been legitimate, that elderly clients often changed their minds, that Bramble never personally profited from most of the altered wills. But when presented with the ledgers, the forged practice pages, and the fake trusts, even the defense faltered. The jury deliberated for just 8 hours. Bramble was found guilty on 18 counts of fraudulent conveyance, 9 counts of will tampering, 4 counts of identity fraud, 3 counts of elder exploitation. He was sentenced to 25 years in Illinois State Correctional Facility, with eligibility for parole after 15. He never appealed. The aftermath in Whitlock. Bramble's mortuary was shut down. The building sat abandoned for a time, the ivy overtaking the windows, the porch sagging. Eventually, a real estate agent converted it into a coffee shop, but few locals visited. The families impacted by the fraud received partial restitution through a state-managed fund. Some sued for more. Others, especially elderly heirs, simply let the matter go too weary to untangle years of lies. One minister at Bramble's former church reflected, "He was the last person in town most people saw. We trusted him to close the chapter, and he wrote the endings himself." And yet, there remain at least 6 estate files where the original wills were never recovered. In those cases, the altered versions remain the only legal documentation. Families suspect wrongdoing, but without evidence, the courts cannot reverse them. Even in disgrace, Bramble's touch endures. And one final note, found tucked into a hymnal left in his office, perhaps speaks to the logic that governed his quiet empire. A man's legacy is not what he leaves behind, but who he leaves it to. Some bloodlines deserve erasure. When the iron doors of Illinois State Correctional Facility closed behind Frederick Bramble in the autumn of 1981, the town of Whitlock exhaled, quietly, cautiously. For a man so soft-spoken, so methodical, his absence left behind a gaping silence. Yet his presence lingered. In family disputes, in probate courtrooms, in dusty safes and rewritten trust documents that no longer reflected the dead's true intentions. And then, 5 years into his sentence on a humid summer morning in 1986, Bramble died in his sleep. No autopsy was requested. No next of kin stepped forward. And once again, he became the custodian of a document that would shape everything left behind. His own will. A posthumous puzzle. It was found in his prison cell, neatly folded inside a book of Psalms, wrapped in linen and bound with a black ribbon. The document was typed on the same 1924 Underwood typewriter that had led to his conviction, a machine Bramble had requested be brought to him upon incarceration. Officials had allowed it, citing its sentimental value. The will was dated 3 years prior to his death. It opened with a sentence that chilled those who read it. As I have authored the conclusions of so many, it is only right I craft my own with equal precision. What followed was a 38-page manifesto disguised as a legal document, part confession, part explanation, and part philosophical treatise on death, legacy, and moral hierarchy. The inheritance that never was. Bramble's will allocated $250,000 to a newly formed educational fund titled the Whitlock Children's Endowment, established for underprivileged students with no living parents. 2/3 of his real estate assets to be converted into a low-income housing trust in nearby Springfield. A small percentage of his savings to be awarded to families who had lost their inheritance due to corrected wills, as he called them, provided, he wrote, they can demonstrate they have lived lives of productive integrity despite being passed over. That line alone sparked outrage. He was still judging them, even in death. The families declined the money. Most of the trust fund was redistributed by court order. But what intrigued investigators most were the dozens of footnotes in the document, brief mentions of files, sealed letters, and documents intended to be opened at a later date. The secret archive. It was an anonymous tip, perhaps even from Bramble himself, mailed before his death that led authorities to a second storage unit 30 miles outside Whitlock. Inside were metal cabinets carefully labeled. Within them, early drafts of wills never filed. Copies of family trees Bramble had built by hand. Photographs of clients' homes, often taken without permission. A series of unfiled obituaries, written in advance for people who were still alive at the time of his arrest. It was a macabre museum of human life, curated not for the public but for his own ledger. In one file, dated 1967, he wrote, Mrs. Riley's daughter has returned, may need to revert to previous version, delay signature. In another, from 1972, Hiram Cobb's son is gambling again. No update necessary, he will waste the land. One file included nothing but a newspaper clipping of a family reunion Bramble had not been invited to. Underneath it, he had written, they forget too quickly. The psychology of a caretaker. Experts reviewing the archive concluded what many had long suspected. Bramble wasn't simply a forger, he was a narrative controller. He didn't just falsify documents, he curated the legacies of those who passed through his funeral home. To him, a will wasn't a legal document, it was a moral instrument, and he alone held the tuning fork. In one folder labeled "Non-Compliance," he wrote, "She refused to update. I left it untouched, let the family inherit, and watched them squander it in a year." Another, more chilling entry. "Mr. Hart changed his mind last minute. Didn't sign. I signed for him. He never would have wanted his son to have the farm, not after that night." To Bramble, his actions weren't crimes. They were corrections. The town tries to move on. In the years following his death, Whitlock slowly emerged from the shadow of the scandal. A new funeral director moved in, with no ties to Bramble legacy. The coffee shop that replaced the mortuary eventually became a community arts center. A small memorial garden was planted at the edge of the cemetery, intended not to honor Bramble, but to acknowledge the loss of trust that scarred the community for decades. But families continued to wonder. What was real? Did they ever truly know the wishes of their loved ones? And how many final words were rewritten by a man with a typewriter and a belief that he knew best? The final impact. Legal scholars still cite State of Illinois v. Bramble in ethics courses, particularly around the misuse of professional roles, documentary trust, and the legal rights of the deceased. It is a case that defies easy labels. Bramble wasn't motivated by greed. He didn't seem to enjoy manipulation. He left most of his ill-gotten gains untouched. Instead, he used power in the most terrifying way, not for benefit but for control, not to profit but to rewrite the story others had authored for themselves. And his legacy still lingers in law books, ethics manuals, and one final detail that remains unsettled: the unfiled will. Among the storage unit's contents was one last will, sealed in an envelope, typed and signed but never filed. It belonged to Alina Glass, a widow who died in 1974, whose estate had been left to a religious foundation in Nebraska. Her family had long suspected fraud but never had proof. This will left her home and savings to her daughter, with a handwritten note attached. "For Marion, I love you even if I couldn't say it." It was clearly dated before the altered version. The statute of limitations had passed. The assets were long gone, but her daughter, now in her 60s, wept upon reading it. "He stole my mother's voice," she said. Reflection. The story of Frederick Bramble isn't one of violence. It contains no blood, no body count. But it stands as a quiet tragedy. A reminder that not all crimes come with sirens or screams. Some arrive in manila envelopes, typed neatly, notarized professionally, and filed in silence. That power, when left unexamined, can turn caretakers into gatekeepers, and gatekeepers into authors of fate. And in a town like Whitlock, the question will always linger: how many endings weren't truly theirs? Story 5. The Locksmith of Leeds Who Knew Too Much. In the heart of Leeds, England, tucked between a row of shuttered storefronts and a retired chapel, stood a narrow shop with a flapping green sign. Halberd Lock and Key, established 1922. Few people noticed it, even fewer entered. The man inside, Peter Halberd, was the third generation in a long line of locksmiths. He was a wiry figure with thinning silver hair, round spectacles, and the kind of stillness that made his movements feel deliberate, mechanical, even rehearsed. Most of his business came from landlords, office managers, and the occasional forgetful husband who'd misplaced a house key. He never advertised, never rushed, and never under any circumstance asked questions. But Peter Halberd knew things about people, about homes, about secrets tucked away behind the locks he crafted, repaired, and quietly cataloged. And eventually, it wasn't his skill with tumblers that drew attention. It was the list he kept in the drawer beneath his bench. The ledger of locks. It began with a simple habit, a logbook. Started by his grandfather in 1922 and maintained meticulously through the decades. It contained addresses, Log types, serial numbers, key duplication counts, special modifications requested, often quietly. Peter inherited the shop and the book in 1978. He continued the tradition, but he added something new. In the margins, written in tidy script, were personal observations, not just about the locks but about the people who lived behind them. Client's wife seemed unaware of secondary key request. Backdoor modified entry lock swapped without tenant's knowledge. Garage lock newly installed. Client insisted it remain off record. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't idle curiosity. Peter called it operational awareness. He said he kept notes in case the police ever came asking. And eventually they did. The first inquiry. In 1986, West Yorkshire police came to Peter's shop with a question about a recent burglary. A house in Roundhay had been cleaned out with no sign of forced entry. Peter confirmed he'd installed the lock, but he'd also duplicated an extra key at the request of the homeowner's business partner, who'd asked that the copy not be documented. Peter had documented it anyway in his ledger. That note helped police track down the partner, who confessed to orchestrating the theft. It made Peter a quiet hero, but it also put him on the radar. Not long after, detectives from a fraud unit came by, asking if Peter had ever serviced a lock for a man under investigation for embezzlement. Peter flipped through his records, paused, and said, "Not only did I install the safe lock, but he requested a bypass and override key. I noted it, of course." The case cracked within days. From that point on, Peter Halberd became more than just a locksmith. He became an unofficial node in the web of Leeds secrets. Not just locks. Over time, Peter developed an unnerving skill, pattern recognition. He noticed when the same faces ordered locks for multiple flats under different names. He noticed when a man asked for a front door lock change and then returned 2 weeks later, asking to put the old one back. He noticed when women came in flustered, alone, asking for locks that couldn't be picked even by professionals. He noticed when the same security firm requested emergency service for 5 properties, all linked to a money laundering operation later, exposed by Scotland Yard. Peter didn't tell anyone what he noticed unless they asked. And even then, he gave them only what was necessary. The phone call that changed everything. In the spring of 1993, Peter received a call from a woman who refused to give her name. She said her home had been broken into twice with no signs of forced entry. "I think it's someone I know," she whispered. "He has a key." Peter asked what kind of lock she had. She described one of his Model H3, brass cylinder, 2-pin override, common but not easy to pick. He remembered the address, remembered the man who'd requested the lock, and he remembered a note he'd written in the margin. Requested master key with no documentation, said it was just in case. Peter told the woman to come to the shop. He replaced her lock free of charge. Then he contacted the police not because of the break-in, but because the man who requested the key had 3 other locks installed in different neighborhoods, all under aliases Peter had quietly cross-referenced in his own ledgers. The man was later arrested for stalking and unlawful entry. The ledgers once again held the key. The wrong kind of attention. As Peter's quiet cooperation with police became more widely known, especially after the stalking case, the media picked up on it. A short article ran in the Leeds Chronicle under the headline, "The Locksmith with a Memory Like a Safe." And that's when Peter's troubles began. He started receiving threats. First, a phone call. "You think you're clever. You keep writing in your little book. Maybe we'll burn the place down, see if you remember everything then." Then a rock through the front window, then another. Peter filed a police report, but nothing came of it. He kept his shop closed for a week, When he reopened, a new fireproof safe stood behind the counter. He placed the ledgers inside, but he began making copies, typed summaries of key transactions, with no names, just patterns, symbols, locations. He mailed them to a cousin in Sheffield, just in case, he told her. He didn't say what for. The night break-in. On a rainy night in October 1994, someone broke into Halberd Lock and Key. The front door wasn't forced. The glass had been cut, quietly. Whoever entered knew how to bypass an alarm system and what they were looking for. When Peter arrived the next morning, the safe was open. But nothing was taken. The ledgers were still there. Instead, they had been rifled through, pages torn, bookmarks removed, tabbed entries missing. Peter didn't call the police. He closed the shop, locked the safe again, and disappeared for 3 days. When he returned, he told a longtime client, "If someone wants to know what I know, they should ask, but no one ever does." And then the fire. In January 1995, just 3 months after the break-in, Halberd Lock and Key burned to the ground. The fire began in the rear workshop. The fire marshal's report stated it was an electrical failure, but Peter had no electric heaters in that section, no recent rewiring, nothing to spark such a blaze. The safe was found and the rubble melted beyond use. The ledgers were gone. Peter, who had not been present during the fire, stood across the street that morning, coat buttoned to the neck, hands in his pockets. He watched in silence. When a bystander asked what he'd do next, Peter replied, "There's more than one way to remember." By the time investigators closed the file on the fire that consumed Halberd Lock and Key, Peter Halberd had already vanished from public view. No press statements, no interviews, no attempt to rebuild the shop. In the official record, it was chalked up to a simple retirement and aging tradesman stepping away after tragedy. But those who had worked with Peter, detectives, solicitors, even a few cautious clients, knew better. Because what Peter left behind wasn't just a burned building. It was a legacy of knowledge that couldn't be extinguished by flame. The copies emerged. Weeks after the fire, an anonymous parcel arrived at the West Yorkshire Police Fraud Division. Inside were typed ledgers, cryptic but detailed, maps with handwritten annotations, a cover note that read simply, "For record keeping, in the event of oversight or silence." Each page listed incidents, names, addresses, some redacted, others coded, but always aligned with events Peter had witnessed or suspected during his years as a locksmith. One detective, reviewing the files, remarked, "It was like someone had mapped the city's criminal activity in keyholes and deadbolts." What followed was a slow, steady unraveling of hidden truths. Case 1. The apartments of Chapeltown. Among Peter's notes were frequent mentions of the same landlord requesting new locks, always under different property management companies. The locks were legitimate, but the notes raised questions. Multiple entries requested in same week, units unoccupied, no tenant notices issued. A deeper investigation found that this landlord had been illegally subletting public housing units, forging leases, and collecting rent from tenants under the table. Worse, many of the tenants were undocumented immigrants, afraid to report maintenance issues or demands for cash. Peter's data gave authorities enough cross-referenced addresses to pursue charges of fraudulent tenancy, housing violations, and money laundering. The landlord was sentenced to 6 years. Peter's name was never mentioned. Case 2, the pub that was. Another entry read, "Lock replacement request. Unusual bar front but internal locks requested for storeroom. Client insisted on magnetic seals. Said no inventory to protect." The pub in question had been shuttered for years, but was now under renovation by a new investor. Peter had noted that the locks were grade 3 commercial vault standards, far beyond what a pub would require. After receiving Peter's notes, police raided the site and uncovered a sophisticated counterfeit alcohol operation labels, fake tax stamps, and a small printing press tucked behind what looked like a keg room. The syndicate behind it had eluded authorities for years. Peter's quiet entry cracked the case. Patterns of protection. Not all of Peter's observations were about crime. Some, in fact, revealed his discreet protection of vulnerable individuals. One woman, living in a modest flat in Hare Hills, had come to Peter in 1991 in fear of her ex-husband. Peter installed a unique lock system, non-standard pins, custom keyway, pressure-sensitive deadbolt, and noted in his ledger. If anyone requests a duplicate, notify immediately. Safety priority. A year later, a man came to the shop asking for just that, a copy of her key. Peter claimed he'd lost the record. Instead, he contacted a detective he trusted. The man was arrested for violating a restraining order. The woman never knew. Peter had engineered a delay, one tumbler at a time. A reputation underground. In the criminal underworld of Leeds, Peter's name began to take on a strange dual reputation. To some, he was a threat and archivist of misdeeds, someone who remembered more than he should, someone who didn't speak unless asked, but when asked, could unravel an entire operation. To others, especially those caught in bad situations, he became a quiet guardian. A whispered name passed around women's shelters. A go-to for locks that couldn't be picked, for bolts that couldn't be forced. Peter never turned anyone away. But he always asked one question. Is this to keep someone out, or to keep something in? If the answer gave him pause, he'd refuse the job. He had rules, even if no one knew what they were. The man behind the ledger. People often tried to understand what motivated Peter Halbert. He didn't seek attention. He never charged more than necessary. He wasn't formally aligned with police. He never asked for compensation or recognition. And he rarely spoke about his family. But one story, told years later by a retired detective, hinted at something deeper. We were walking to his car after a burglary case. I asked him why he kept such detailed notes. He said, "My father let someone in once. Didn't mean to, but he did. And someone died. I suppose I've been closing doors ever since." No one ever confirmed what Peter meant. But the way he said it stayed with people. The final puzzle. 3 years after the fire that destroyed his shop, a posthumous letter arrived at the desk of the detective inspector who had worked with Peter on multiple cases. Peter had died quietly in 1998, no funeral, no obituary. Only a solicitor and a cremation record confirmed it. But the letter, dated months earlier, read, "By the time you receive this, I will be elsewhere. There's a key buried beneath the sycamore tree behind the chapel. It opens a box I left for you. Inside are the names I never wrote down, the ones I couldn't." Police found the box. Inside were 3 names. 2 were known criminals' men, under long-standing investigation. The third was a sitting city councilor, with no criminal record. Attached to his name was a note. He asked for 5 sets of keys. 3 were for flats that didn't belong to him. The tenants never knew. I couldn't prove more, but I know what I know. That entry triggered a new investigation. The councilor was later linked to a decade-long coercion scheme, using access to properties to blackmail vulnerable individuals. Peter had held the secret for years because no one had asked. The locks that tell stories. In his quiet way, Peter Halbert revealed something most never consider. That a lock is never just a lock. It's a measure of fear, a symbol of control, a boundary between lives, a reflection of what someone needs to keep hidden or safe. And Peter, unlike most, had listened to the locks, to the way people spoke about them, to what they did and didn't ask him to do. He was not just a locksmith. He was a recorder of truths left unspoken. In the final years of Peter Halbert's life, no one knew exactly where he lived. Some said he'd moved in with a cousin in Sheffield. Others believed he lived in a single-room flat above a closed-down tailor's shop just outside Morley. But what remained clear was this. Though his shop had burned and his ledgers were scattered, Peter continued to keep records. Not written, not typed, but remembered. Detectives described him as haunted but sharp. Former clients, once scared to speak, began to acknowledge his role in solving crimes that no one else even knew existed. A solicitor, who managed his small estate after his death, found dozens of envelopes unmarked, sealed, left with instructions to deliver only if someone ever comes looking. In many cases, someone eventually did. And every time, the contents cracked the case wide open. The man who collected doors. One of the strangest discoveries came 2 years after his death. A new homeowner, renovating a converted barn outside Otley, found something peculiar in a sealed crawlspace, an old oak cabinet, chained and padlocked. Inside, 24 keys, labels written in code, and a small plaque on the back of the cabinet, engraved with the words, "Some doors should never be reopened." Each key, upon analysis, matched long-abandoned properties in and around, leads many of them associated with old criminal investigations, illegal boarding houses, or suspected trafficking locations. The cabinet was dubbed Halbert's Archive. The keys became forensic gold. In one instance, a cold case from 1985 involving a missing teenage girl was reopened when her belongings were found in one of the properties listed by the keys. Peter had never said a word. He had simply preserved the key, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The child behind the safe. Not every story uncovered after Peter's death ended in prosecution. Some ended in closure. In 1996, a child just 7 years old had been found locked inside a basement storage unit, frightened but unharmed. The man arrested at the time refused to name how he had secured access to the unit, which had required a high-security key cylinder used only by commercial locksmiths. The case went unsolved until 2001, when one of Peter's sealed letters was opened by police. It read, "Storage Unit 7B asked to install a tamper-proof padlock. Said it was for sound equipment. He lied. Gave me a bad feeling. I left a backup key under the second floor grating." They checked. The key was there. DNA later found in the unit led to a rearrest and conviction. That one page from Peter had sat quietly in an envelope, waiting for the right eyes. The lost apprentice. Very few people knew that, for a short time, Peter had taken on a young apprentice. His name was Tom Beach, a quiet teenager from Halbeck who wandered into the shop in the early 1990s, asking if he could learn how locks worked. Peter refused at first, but Tom kept coming back. Eventually, Peter let him sweep the floor, then watch him work, then practice filing duplicate keys. Eventually, Peter taught him about the philosophy of locks, how each design reflected a different kind of fear. They worked together for 2 years. Then Tom disappeared. Years later, Peter told a client, "Tom was smart, too smart. I think someone offered him more than I ever could." In 2005, long after Peter's death, Tom resurfaced as a consultant for a corporate security firm in London, specializing in penetration testing for high-risk buildings. His approach was considered unorthodox. He credited everything he knew to a locksmith who taught me to see locks as stories. When asked if he knew what happened to Peter's remaining records, Tom only said, "He didn't need to write them down. He kept them in the order of things: the police and the pact. After the final round of Peter's sealed documents were opened and sorted, a curious directive emerged, one included in 6 identical letters, each sent to a different senior officer. The letters read, "You've asked me for help over the years, sometimes directly, sometimes by way of the locks themselves. This is a ledger of names I never reported, not because they didn't deserve it, but because they weren't ready to be found. If you open these names, you must follow the same rule I did. Ask why. Ask who it protects. Then ask who it harms. If the harm outweighs the justice, close the file. If not, turn the key." This was not legal instruction, but it was Peter's moral code. It was said that a few of those names were indeed investigated. Others were never touched. And in at least one case, a file was returned unopened with the words, "It's not time. The quietest crime." In the end, Peter Halberd may have never committed a crime himself. He forged nothing. He stole nothing. He manipulated no one. But his legacy poses an uncomfortable question. Is it a crime to know too much? In a world where privacy is paramount and suspicion is easily abused, Peter lived in the gray. He recorded what he saw. He noticed what others missed. He gave silence where it was earned and truth where it was needed. And in doing so, he blurred the line between observer and actor, between the locksmith and the lock itself. Reflection: what's left unlocked? Peter Halberd left no fortune, no obituary, no plaque, no published memoir. And yet his story remains deeply embedded in leads carried in whispers between retired police officers, in redacted case files, in grateful words from families who were kept safe because of a lock that couldn't be copied. He reminds us that not all legacies are written in fame or failure. Some are engraved into habits, into ledgers no one asked to see, into locks no one asked to be explained, into keys that still exist without doors. Story 6: The Choir Boy's Coin Scam. It began in the back pews of St. Dominic's Cathedral, in the bustling city of Cincinnati, Ohio, in the spring of 2003. Soft rays of colored light filtered through the stained glass windows, falling upon neat rows of hymnals and well-worn kneelers. Choir practice was underway, boys in red cassocks and white surplices standing with disciplined posture, voices lifted in reverence. Among them was a 15-year-old with a soft tenor voice and a reputation for good behavior, Elliot Maher. He was a model student, altar server, and occasional soloist. But Elliot harbored a secret far more elaborate than anyone in the congregation could have imagined. He wasn't just singing hymns in Latin. He was also forging rare coins and selling them online. The makings of a collector. Elliot had always been precocious. From age 10, he spent hours in the dusty back rooms of the Cincinnati Public Library, devouring old auction catalogs and coin collectors' guides. By 12, he was familiar with the differences between a draped bust dollar and a flowing hair half-cent. He knew the value of a misplaced mint mark, the allure of a double dime. He wasn't just interested in collecting. He wanted to understand how coins were made, how they tricked the eye, how centuries of smudges and strikes told a story. At 13, he discovered metal stamping. At 14, he'd acquired a hobby-grade engraving press from a retired machinist, tucked away in his grandmother's garage. And by 15, he'd made his first fake. It was a nearly flawless 1909 SVDB Lincoln cent, one of the most sought-after pennies in American numismatics. He listed it on eBay under the username St. Numies. It sold for $720. The buyer left a glowing review. The innocence of presentation. To anyone watching Elliot in church, he was the last person you'd suspect of criminal mischief. His choir robes were always neatly pressed, his hair combed back with near-monastic precision. His backpack contained Latin textbooks, rosary beads, and tucked carefully between the pages of his choir sheet, a folded coin pricing guide annotated in red ink. He kept a small tackle box hidden in the garage. Its contents: 1940s wheat pennies for base metal, electroplating chemicals, precision files, magnifying lenses, microlathes, a folder labeled eBay buyer info. He didn't think of it as theft. "I wasn't stealing," he later told authorities. "I was performing like any art form." And he believed, perhaps rightfully, that he was good at it. The first suspicion: Elliot's downfall didn't come from the buyers. Most were hobbyists, eager to believe they'd found a once-in-a-lifetime deal. The coin community can be eagerly optimistic when the price is just low enough to tempt belief, but high enough to suggest legitimacy. No, his first real problem came from a janitor. Mike Thurman, the cathedral's longtime custodian, had seen Elliot in the garage during hours he shouldn't have been there. At first, he assumed the boy was just hiding out, maybe avoiding chores or skipping a school commitment. But then he noticed the smell. Like metal and vinegar, chemical, why not like paint or glue, something sharper. Thurman peeked through a dusty pane and saw Elliot hunched over a workbench, wearing gloves and goggles, holding what looked like a stamp and blank coin disc. He didn't say anything at first, until a week later, when he read a headline in the local paper: "Rare coin collector, duped by teen seller, eBay fraud under investigation." Investigators take notice. In early May 2003, the Numismatic Crime Information Center, NCIC, received a report from a suspicious coin dealer in Chicago. He had purchased a supposedly rare 1877 Indian head penny from a user named St. Numies. The package included a handwritten note with fake provenance and even a photocopied certificate of authenticity with a typo. That typo triggered the dealer's suspicions. The certificate misspelled Philadelphia as Philadelphia. He contacted the NCIC. That's when Elliot Maher's operation began to unravel. A digital trail in a sacred space. Elliot had made two critical mistakes. He had shipped all packages using a church-affiliated return address under the guise of youth choir fundraising. He had used the church computer lab, which logged IP addresses for managing eBay listings and customer communication. The irony wasn't lost on investigators. A religious institution, inadvertently serving as the hub of a counterfeiting operation. Authorities contacted Father Gregory Morin, the cathedral's priest. "He's just a boy," Morin reportedly said. "He sings like an angel." But federal postal inspectors weren't interested in choir solos. They subpoenaed eBay transaction records. They traced the IP activity. They paid a visit to the cathedral. The interrogation in the confessional. When Elliot was confronted, he did something no one expected. He confessed immediately. Not in court, not to police, but in the cathedral confessional. He told Father Morin everything: how it started, the methods he used, how he read old collector forums to replicate patina and wear patterns, how he never sold to repeat customers, how he felt safe behind the facade of piety. Morin, torn between spiritual obligation and civic duty, convinced Elliot to tell his parents, who then brought him to speak with investigators without legal representation. That may have been the only strategic misstep Elliot made in the entire scheme. Because once he began talking, the breadth of the fraud came into focus. A multi-state scheme. Over the span of 2 years, Elliot Maher had forged and sold over 180 fake coins, many with verifiable provenance, netted approximately $35,000 in profits, most of which was still unspent. maintained detailed spreadsheets of coin types, buyer locations, and production notes, studied shipping pattern to avoid detection by coin-grading agencies, even attempted a few replica Roman coins, which didn't sell but impressed numismatic experts for their historical accuracy. He had, in essence, created a full-fledged coin forgery ring while singing psalms on Sundays. Community response. When news of Elliot's actions broke, the reaction was a mix of shock, pity, and confusion. Some called him a misunderstood genius, others a manipulative fraudster. One retired coin dealer referred to him as the Mozart of metalwork, only with a criminal tune. The church faced criticism for unintentionally harboring criminal activity. Elliot was placed under house arrest pending trial. His case, due to his age, was kept largely private. But among the coin community, he became a quiet legend. Even some of his victims refused to press charges, citing admiration for the craftsmanship. The ending of a first movement. As Section 1 closes, one can't help but marvel at the strange duality of Elliot Maher's life. A gifted choir boy with the voice of a cherub, a meticulous counterfeiter with the hands of a master engraver, a teen who loved the beauty of coins so deeply he decided to make his own reality. But as the trial approached and prosecutors began weighing federal charges, one question lingered. Was Elliot's deception a crime of greed or a compulsion of artistry, misdirected by a teenage obsession? The courtroom was a long way from the cathedral. Gone were the red choir robes, the scent of incense, and the warm acoustics of hymnals echoing through high arches. In their place stood fluorescent lights, government seal emblems, and the cool, metallic whisper of handcuffs. Elliot Maher, now 16, stood before a juvenile court judge in Hamilton County, Ohio, accused of orchestrating one of the most sophisticated youth-led fraud schemes in modern e-commerce history. Though many still saw him as just a boy, the case quickly escalated far beyond the scope of youthful mischief. Because while the coins were fake, the trail of deception was very real. Prosecutors billed their case. By the time formal charges were filed, federal authorities had compiled a 160-page dossier on Elliot's operation, including eBay transactions across 23 U.S. states, shipping records tied to over 180 forged coins, email communications where Elliot impersonated antique dealers, detailed notes in his handwriting, chemical ratios, where aging techniques, comparison photos of original versus replica coins, a spreadsheet titled St. Numi's Inventory, Q3 Targets. He faced charges under wire fraud statutes, counterfeiting of numismatic items, a federal offense, mail fraud, criminal impersonation. Though he was a minor, the sheer scale of the operation pushed prosecutors to consider transferring his case to adult court. The defense, art or crime. Elliot's court-appointed attorney, Sheila Costas, was both baffled and intrigued by the case. In her opening argument, she framed Elliot not as a predator, but as a gifted, obsessive youth who became consumed by a world that values perfection above honesty. My client, she told the judge, did not defraud banks. He did not steal credit cards. He did not use violence or threats. He created an illusion, a craft, even and people believed it because they wanted to. He is not a criminal. He is a perfectionist. It was a bold strategy, and one that resonated with certain observers. But prosecutors countered with sharp clarity. This wasn't a teenage prank. This was a multi-year operation involving calculated lies, forged provenance, and financial gain. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew it was wrong. They played recordings of Elliot responding to suspicious buyers, offering partial refunds to smooth over concerns, and even coaching customers on how to convince grading services of a coin authenticity. One email read, Just tell them you inherited it from your uncle. Don't say where you got it. They'll trust the patina. Witnesses take the stand. Several buyers were called to testify. Most admitted that Elliot's work was impressively convincing. One said the coin passed 2 levels of preliminary screening before being flagged at a professional grading service. Another, a retired banker, said he didn't want to report Elliot after learning the seller was a minor. He tricked me, but I admired him. Even a former U.S. Mint employee, brought in as an expert witness, conceded. Whoever made these had a better eye than most adult forgers we've encountered. But admiration didn't equal exoneration. The monetary losses added up to over $35,000, not to mention the reputational damage to coin marketplaces and the emotional blow to passionate collectors. One elderly man broke down in tears during his testimony. That penny, it reminded me of the one my father gave me before he died. I thought I had found it again, but it was a lie. The confessional dilemma. A dramatic twist emerged when Father Gregory Morin was called to testify. Bound by his religious obligation to maintain confessional secrecy, he could not divulge what Elliot had shared in the cathedral booth. However, because Elliot had later repeated those same admissions outside the church, in front of his parents and legal authorities, Morin was able to speak to character, but not the content of the confession. He described Elliot as quietly brilliant, deeply remorseful, a boy who never grasped how far he had gone into darkness until it was too late. He urged leniency, not dismissal of consequences, but the chance for rehabilitation instead of ruin. Behind the genius, psychological insights. As the court struggled to understand Elliot's motivation, a court-ordered psychological evaluation was introduced. The findings were as fascinating as they were disturbing. The examiner described Elliot as exhibiting high-functioning, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, a near-savant level understanding of coin geometry, metallurgic properties, and design mimicry, low empathy for buyers, but not out of malice, rather, a detachment from economic consequences in favor of aesthetic achievement. One excerpt from the report read, "The subject sees coins not as currency or collectibles, but as puzzles artifacts he can replicate with greater precision than those who originally minted them. His deception is not rooted in greed, but in the pursuit of mastery." This blurred the line between intentional fraud and neurodivergent compulsion. But the court still had to reckon with damage done. A narrow verdict. After several days of deliberation, the judge reached a decision that walked a legal tightrope. Elliot would not be tried as an adult. He was found guilty on multiple counts of juvenile fraud and counterfeiting. He was sentenced to a rehabilitative program, 12 months at a youth correctional facility with mandatory therapy, 3 years probation, full restitution to victims, facilitated through a structured work-study release. The court also ordered that Elliot was prohibited from engaging in any numismatic activity, buying, selling, or creating coins until the age of 21. It was, for all intents and purposes, a second chance, one that he had to earn. The world watches. Word of the case spread across online coin forums, collector communities, and even tech blogs. Nicknamed the Choir Boy Forger, Elliot Maher became a mythic figure in niche circles. Some questioned whether banning him from coin-related activities would suppress his talents or simply force them underground again. Others speculated whether, given better mentorship and structure, Elliot could one day become a master engraver, even for the U.S. Mint itself. A retired Secret Service consultant quipped, "Honestly, if he applied himself, we might one day pay him to detect the kind of forgeries he used to make." But the more immediate concern was what Elliot might become. It was what he had already revealed. That in the era of digital marketplaces, anonymity, and youth tech fluency, a teenager with a few tools and an obsession could quietly outsmart entire systems. An unresolved coin toss. As Section 2 draws to a close, the question remains: can a criminal mind be redeemed by talent? Or will that talent, if left unsupervised, continue to manifest in darker ways? Elliot Maher may have left the courtroom a convicted juvenile offender, but he also left as something else. A case study in how brilliance, when left unchecked, can twist even the purest passions into deception. The headlines had faded. The courtroom was now a memory. By the time Elliot Maher was released from the Youth Rehabilitation Center in 2005, his name had become something of a cautionary tale, passed around in coin-collecting forums and whispered among eBay seller groups. Don't get burned like those guys who bought from that choir boy. But Elliot wasn't thinking about forums. He wasn't thinking about coins either. For the first time in years, he was forced to exist outside the glow of obsession, outside the narrow perfection of mint marks and die rotations. The terms of his probation were clear. No collecting, no engraving, no listing anything for sale online, no direct or indirect participation in numismatic activity of any kind. It was, in a sense, a banishment from his world. And yet it may have saved him. Rebuilding with restrictions. Under the structured reentry program assigned by the court, Elliot was placed in a technical mentorship initiative for youth offenders with high aptitude scores. While he couldn't work with coins, he was allowed to study mechanical engineering, particularly materials science and microfabrication fields that seemed to scratch the same itch. He was placed with a retired tool and die technician named Mr. Abram Coates, who lived outside Cincinnati and ran a small repair shop, restoring antique instruments and custom machining parts for old grandfather clocks. Elliot took to it immediately. There was something soothing about the work. The rhythmic laughing, the slow alignment of gears, the subtle art of replicating something exactly, but not dishonestly. Mr. Coates didn't ask about the coin forgeries. But one day, after Elliot had flawlessly replicated a clock pendulum gear from scratch, he said, "If you ever turn that eye of yours back toward crime, kid, it'd take the rest of us 5 years to catch up." The victim letters, part of Elliot's court-mandated rehabilitation, involved writing personal letters of apology to every confirmed buyer affected by his coin scam. Some letters were returned unopened. Some buyers responded with venom, but others surprised him. One elderly collector in Montana replied, "I forgave you long ago. I kept the coin, not as a collectible but as a reminder even beauty can lie." Another buyer wrote, "I took your coin to a high school class and used it as a teaching tool. You did wrong, but your work made an impression. That counts for something." One man, a retired Navy machinist, included a hand-sketched blueprint for a micro-stamping press and a note. "If you ever go legit, kid, here's a real challenge." These letters Elliot kept in a small wooden box, separate from everything else. The offer that changed everything. In 2008, with only 6 months left on probation, Elliot received a discreet invitation forwarded by his parole officer from an agency operating under the U.S. Treasury Department. They weren't hearing him. Not yet. They simply wanted to know, would he be willing to meet? The agency specialized in anti-counterfeiting intelligence, and they were developing new protocols to combat online fraud in niche markets: stamps, rare art, signed memorabilia, and coins. The meeting took place in a nondescript office suite in Columbus. A man introduced himself only as Agent Riley and laid out the terms. "We're not offering you a badge or a title. What we want is your brain. You know how these kids think because you were one of them. You built a better fake. Now we want to build better detection. Elliot asked, "Is this legal under my sentencing?" Agent Riley smiled. "We helped write your sentencing, Elliot." Redemption forged slowly. After completing his probation and turning 21, Elliot legally changed his name. Not to escape guilt, he said, but to signal a true transition from boy forger to adult builder. Under his new name, he began working in forensic microfabrication, consulting on everything from counterfeit detection to precision authentication tools for museums and collectors. He helped build micro-engraving markers, invisible to the naked eye, but detectable by spectrometer scans. He developed anti-replica watermarking for high-value commemorative coins. In time, he was even invited anonymously to sit on a panel for the American Numismatic Association, helping them identify trends in modern counterfeiting rings. Few knew who he truly was, but the ones who mattered did. And they watched closely, revisiting the past. In 2013, a private collector in Illinois sent a request to the ANA's Counterfeit Detection Lab. He'd recently purchased a coin, an 1894 S. Barber dime, one of the rarest in existence, allegedly worth millions. He wanted to verify authenticity. The coin was routed through standard checks, all of which it passed. But one specialist reviewing high-res scans spotted a micro-scratch, invisible to the human eye but familiar in curvature and placement. It was Elliot's signature technique. He examined the coin himself and immediately recognized his own early work, made over a decade ago. The coin had changed hands multiple times. It was now insured for more than $1.4 million. But it was a fake. His fake. He reported it, of course. But the moment sat with him, not as fear, not even as shame, but as a quiet reckoning. "I held something that never should have existed," he would later write. And yet it did, perfectly, long enough to be believed. The danger isn't in what we fake. It's in what we're willing to believe when the story is beautiful enough. A legacy in shadows. Elliot never returned to coin forging. He never tried to recapture the thrill of the scam or test the limits of legality again. Instead, he dedicated himself to education. He now teaches a course under a pseudonym on the ethics of precision at a design institute. He mentors students who show signs of the same obsessive genius that once ruled him. He teaches them that mastery without integrity leads to hollow victories. And that sometimes the most valuable thing you can craft is a boundary you refuse to cross. Final reflection, the coin that was. There's a story Elliot sometimes tells his students about a coin he never made. An 1856 Flying Eagle sent a piece so rare, it would have sold instantly. He drew the blueprints, he studied the metallurgy, but something stopped him. He says, "I didn't fake that one because it meant too much to the people who chased it. It wasn't about the money, it was about the story, and I realized I didn't want to ruin that story." He never made the coin, but maybe that's where his real redemption began. Not in the forgeries he perfected, but in the ones he chose not to create.